per strane questioni del destino, tutta una serie di coincidenze, di sensibilità di personaggi che vengono a contatto con questi reperti che, io sottolineo, a quel tempo ancora non si sapeva veramente che cosa fossero. Come ha detto Laura Donatelli, erano testimonianze mute. Ricordo le date: 1822, il primo eureka nella testa di Champollion, che però non voleva dire che i geroglifici potessero essere letti, perché ci sono voluti ancora almeno 2 decenni, 3 decenni prima che si riuscisse a completamente penetrare questa complessa architettura linguistica dei geroglifici e della scrittura comunque egizia. Però ad un certo punto viene fatto un salto dall'Egitto all'Italia e poi negli Stati Uniti. E adesso io vorrei dare il benvenuto a Richard Bennet. Grazie per essere qua, professor Bennet, professore emerito della Brigham Young University di Provo, nello Utah, docente di dottrina e storia della Chiesa di Gesù Cristo dei Santi degli Ultimi Giorni.
The purpose of my presentation today is to explore the life and the character of Antonio Lebolo and to honor his contributions, especially as they relate to the rise of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. After several years studying Lebolo, I had hoped that by this time we would have known so much more than ever before about this man from Castellamonte. However, the fact remains that he lived in the shadows of such giants as Bernardino Drovetti, his mentor and fellow Piedmontese, and the unpredictable Pasha Ali Muhammad, governor of Egypt, and of course, Jean-Francois Champollion, the father of modern Egyptology. Therefore, Lebolo comes across history as a shadow, like a second or third fiddle in a large orchestra. Man relegated almost to oblivion, who left no paper trail or pictorial trail, a historical phantom. And yet, without Lebolo, the Book of Abraham, treasured by millions of members of the rapidly growing Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints throughout the world, that book would never have come to light, would never have been translated and canonized as one of the most defining books of Scripture in Mormondom. Canonized in 1880 as part of the Pearl of Great Price, the importance of the Book of Abraham is on the rise. As Terrell Givens, a leading Latter-day Saints scholar, has recently argued, the Book of Abraham is a child of a tumultuous and complicated parentage. On one side was American fascination with antiquities, ancient civilizations, mummies, and the lost books of the Bible. And on the other side were Joseph Smith's revelatory proclivities, a voracious appetite to recover, reconstruct, and reconstitute lost worlds and celestial realms. Despite continuing controversies swirling about its origins and methods of translation, a long list of Mormon scholars from B.H. Roberts to Hugh Nibley and to Terrell Givens praise its importance, even to the point of affirming that the Book of Abraham is the linchpin of Mormon temple theology, that it is the heart and soul of the Latter-day Saint restoration, and that without it, modern Mormon temple worship, with so many rich references to the gospel of Abraham, would never have developed. If this book is of such great importance, it behooves us, therefore, to reclaim Lebolo, who in all likelihood discovered the Egyptian papyri and did so in or near 1820, a celebrated year in Mormon history, the same year as Joseph Smith's first vision in upstate New York. Not that long ago, Mormon scholars knew of Lebolo only because Oliver Cowdery, Joseph Smith's scribe and primary witness, mentioned Lebolo as the source of the papyri from which the Book of Abraham would come. For years, we didn't even know how to spell his name, let alone appreciate his work. In Carrie Muhlstein's and my efforts to publish a forthcoming book entitled tentatively, Out of Egypt, the Coming Forth of the Book of Abraham, we stand on the shoulders of giants, now gone or still with us. Scholars such as Donnell Peterson, James R. Clark, J.M. Todd, Hugh Nibley, Laura Donatelli, Ronald Ridley, Sylvia Guichard, S.J. Wolfe, John Gee, who is with us tonight, Bruce Porter, Dan Vogel, Richard Bushman, Terrell Givens, Brian Hoglid, and others who have made or are now making valuable contributions to this important field of study. In the years since Peterson's remarkable path-breaking book was published 30 years ago, several new collections have come to light. Biographies, collections of letters, documents that shed new important light on the life and history of Lebolo. We owe each one a debt of gratitude. And special thanks today go out from all of us to Emilio Champagne, our other man from Castellamonte, for continuing the research, for masterminding and organizing this conference, and for promoting our way forward. My own interest in Lebolo began several years ago while writing my book, 1820, Prelude to the Restoration. Y'all have to go buy it. A deliberate attempt to show the world context at the time of Joseph Smith's founding first vision. In writing that study, I came to realize that there were, in B.H. Roberts' terms, earlier lights in the morning than Joseph Smith, and that there were men and women of such stature as Champollion, Napoleon, Wilberforce, Humboldt, Drovetti, and other Europeans who played remarkable roles in their own spheres of influence that prepared the way. I began to see that there was much more to Joseph Smith and his work than in upstate New York. Perhaps all roads do lead to Rome, or at least to Italy. So here we are today, just a few kilometers away from one of the finest Egyptian museums in the world, and several thousands of miles away from the headquarters of the Church of Jesus Christ in Utah, both of which, in my opinion, have shown casual disregard, if not disrespect, for our Piedmontese adventurer, Lebolo. Consequently, my study today will be to review briefly what we already know about Lebolo, what we're beginning to understand more clearly, and to point out some important unknowns, pointer for future research. Now, in recent years, the ongoing theological debates over the Book of Abraham have centered primarily on the methodology and authenticity of Joseph Smith's translation of the papyri. Very serious debates over these papyri that accompanied Lebolo's 4 remaining mummies when Joseph Smith finally purchased them in 1835. John Gee is probably, and with Carrie, the leading scholars on these debates. Whatever these arguments may be, my thesis is as follows. Without Lebolo and his collection of mummies and their papyri, without his discovering of them somewhere near Thebes, without their successful and safe shipment to America, without their all but miraculous preservation over land and sea, without them, there would never have been a Book of Abraham. Possession was essential to translation. It didn't come out of the sky. However that translation may have occurred, and whatever Joseph Smith's revelations may have been, he had to have the papyri that he got from Egypt. A little bit of Lebolo. Born in January 1781 in this magnificent city in the Piedmont. Father Pietro, a respected citizen and well-known grocer and shopkeeper in the community, served on the municipal council as late as 1812. His mother was Mariana Muta. His siblings included a brother, Giovanni Pietro Antonio Lebolo, and 3 sisters. He married his first wife in 1797 in the local Catholic church. They had 2 sons, Pietro Giuseppe, who died in 1800, and Pietro Antonio Lebolo, born 10 years later. Growing up only 15 kilometers apart, Lebolo may have known the man who was destined to wield more influence on his life than any other person. Bernardino Drovetti, like the much better known Drovetti, Lebolo had welcomed Napoleon's invasion of the Piedmont in 1798. Both men joined the French Republican forces, in which Lebolo served with some distinction as an official and was well known as the good Monsieur Lebolo. Though not as well educated or as decorated as Drovetti, Lebolo volunteered to serve in the Cavalry Gendarmerie Corps in 1799 and was promoted sergeant in 1800. And like Drovetti, Lebolo was wounded while fighting for Napoleon, the rebellion of San Agostino, and was discharged in 1802. Returning home, he remained loyal to the French occupation as a gendarme, seeking out and punishing draft dodgers, deserters, and others who were critical of Napoleon. However, things began to go sour with Napoleon's retreat from Italy and ultimate defeat at Waterloo in 1815. With the Austrian re-annexation of the Piedmont in 1814, Lebolo found himself in a potentially life-threatening position. If not seen by some as a traitor, then certainly as too diligent a defender of their vanquished foe. His past efforts in the French Carabinieri at exposing and punishing draft dodgers and deserters had become a sword over his head, and he rightly sensed his life was in jeopardy. If there was a chance to leave Italy, even for a short term, he was bound to take it, even if it meant leaving his wife Maria and young son Pietro behind. Fleeing Italy for Egypt was therefore attractive to him for at least three reasons: personal safety, to support his family financially, and to find meaningful work with a trusted, likely well-known acquaintance. Carlo Vidua, another highly regarded Piedmontese, knew Lebolo and Drovetti very well, and is on record as saying Drovetti sought out Lebolo as a worthy assistant. Now very much involved in full-time excavation of his own between his two appointments as French proconsul in Egypt, Drovetti was anxiously looking for another trusted field agent, perhaps as a bodyguard of sorts, someone like a former policeman could take care of himself in potentially harmful surroundings. And if that someone could help Drovetti find buyers back in Europe for his growing collections of antiquities, so much the better. Lebolo, a former gendarme and trusted friend, and with contacts in the Piedmontese and throughout Europe, fit the bill perfectly. Lebolo wasted little time accepting Drovetti's invitation. It would be Drovetti who would hire Lebolo, Drovetti who would introduce him to his growing corps of adventurers that by this time included Frédéric Caillot, Jean-Jacques Riffaut, and Joseph Rosignana. Drovetti who would introduce him to the rigors of excavating Egyptian antiquities. And it would even be Drovetti who would introduce him to his second wife. So he soon left Italy and was in Alexandria when he joined Drovetti's party of excavators. Rosignana would prove to be Lebolo's most trusted friend, and most references to Lebolo will include vague mentions of this equally obscure figure. Lebolo spent most of his time in the area of Thebes, where he lived for at least 2 years in an underground house, and from where he directed the excavation efforts of hundreds of locals, some of whom died working for him in underground caves. And without question, Lebolo developed detractors and critics. But his home, full of mummies, papyri, and other antiquities, became a place of hospitality to many visitors and a center for widespread excavations in the nearby Valley of the Kings. Of Lebolo's humble domicile but significant discoveries, Caillot observed, "Upon our arrival in Gurna," he wrote in August 1820, "Monsieur Lebolo took me to his home to open together the tomb where he had collected his antiquities. I myself opened the crate concerning the papyri, and one after another I studied them all. But as I had predicted, the so-called one in hieroglyphics did not exist. I found 3 with hieratic and Greek characters, which will nevertheless be of great use to the understanding of hieroglyphics." Precisely where Lebolo found his mummies that eventually came to America, precisely where is still unknown. This was good, very good. But they undoubtedly came from this region. Another of Lebolo's great accomplishments was gaining the trust of his employer, Drovetti, who gave him license to work on his own. As we've heard from Laura Drovetti, in the years from 1815 to 1821, had decided to remain in Egypt between his consularship appointments and to seek out on his own in search of antiquity. Eventually, Drovetti amassed superb collections of his own, by far the largest of which he sold in 1824 to the King of Sardinia. So in several important ways, Lebolo's much smaller sister collection, and especially his interest in papyri and mummies, mirrored that of Drovetti's. I'm going to skip a little bit, so not to talk too long. But that fight between Lebolo and Belzoni, can you believe Belzoni? Belzoni had many prejudices. You must take some of what Belzoni said about Lebolo with a grain of salt. Belzoni held as many prejudices as the rest of them. Let's just say that Lebolo knew how to handle and protect himself. He was no worse or no better, perhaps, than the others. Rifo, John Guy could speak to Rifo. With the discovery of the papers of Jean-Jacques Rifo in Switzerland, we see a widening jealousy among Drovetti's own company of adventurers. A staunch French nationalist, Rifo could never understand how Drovetti, Lebolo, and other Italians were in such favor with the Pasha Ali, who extended full authorization and permission to Drovetti, his favorite advisor, and Henry Salt in their search for fame and fortune throughout Egypt. Very important point. Everything that Drovetti and Lebolo excavated was with the full permission of the Egyptian government. That's very important. It must be admitted that Rifo had many negative things to say about Lebolo, that he was a criminal, a fugitive from justice, a malevolent president. But the truth is, Rifo was equally jealous of all Italians, especially Drovetti, and said as many negative things about them as he did Lebolo. It may be well to remember that the claims of an insanely jealous man may not always be taken at full value. Still, this is an area begging for future research. I'll skip a bit. Lebolo will come back to Italy with Bernardino's nephew, Bernardino Drovetti, and will begin to sell horses all over. But here's what I want to tell. When Lebolo returned to Castellamonte to take up a grocery and drugstore business, he had with him as Emilio has said, a decent fortune, a middle-ish fortune worth 100,000 francs. He lost little time investing over 12,000 lira, 12,000 lira in 9 different properties in the Piedmont. How it was that he died bankrupt 3 years later, we do not know. Suffice it to say that his debtors realized insufficient reimbursement from the auctioning off of all of his properties in Castellamonte. He had a collection of 2,000 wine bottles, but he had 11 mummies stored secretly in Trieste. We are tracing the travels of those mummies now. Go to Trieste to a man named Albano Oblasser, a famous Trieste marine merchant who would in turn find American buyers. We still don't know yet the terms of the sale or where it was made, but we know that the shipments of those 11 mummies came to America in 1833 to New York City, likely accompanied by a power of attorney, Francesco Bertola of Castellamonte, who had moved to America earlier, Philadelphia. So there in brief, Antonio Lebolo, our still elusive man from Castellamonte, he was clearly a little of the sinner and a part of the saint. He had as many detractors as he did supporters. And like so many others of his contemporaries, he was driven by self-preservation and a desire, if not for fame, then certainly for some fortune. Count Vidua thought highly of him, and Drovetti trusted him more than he did his own nephew. Unquestionably, Lebolo was a poor businessman and an even worse investor. But he had dreams that someday, somehow, a portion of what was once an impressive estate would come to America. Little could he have known the enormous legacy of faith his discoveries would one day have on the membership of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who are seeking to understand him more now than ever before. Thank you.
Grazie a Richard Bennet e per la sua appassionata difesa anche di Antonio Lebolo.